Hi everyone, welcome back to another intense story. No voiceovers, no dialogues, just moments, choices, and the weight behind them. Tonight, we witness Tu Tieu uncover a shocking truth. Mr. Tuan has been secretly taking company funds from Uri. With courage, strategy, and undeniable evidence, Tu Tieu and Uri take the first steps toward justice. Watch closely. Every moment matters. Every decision counts. The room sank into a heavy silence. Dim light slipped through the window frame, casting pale shadows across Uri's ashen face. Tu Tieu sat close beside the bed, her eyes fixed on every labored breath, as if losing focus for even a second would mean losing the most precious thing she had left. The air around her grew thick with unease, each tick of the clock echoing harshly, stretching time into an unbearable eternity. In her clenched hands trembled a fragile mixture of fear and worry, as though she were holding on to a secret on the verge of breaking apart. Outside, the wind slipped softly through the cracks, stirring the curtain ever so slightly. But nothing could dispel the suffocating weight that blanketed the room. Determination flickered in her gaze, yet deep within, an unshakable tremor lingered, betraying the storm of dread she tried to suppress. She knew this moment was not simply about caring for Uri. It was about confronting an inevitable truth inching closer with every breath. Uri's ragged gasps echoed like an unspoken warning inside her head. No other sound existed, only the pounding weight of her own heartbeat. The space became a fragile fracture, a thin border between hope and despair, where one blink could tip everything into irreversible darkness. The weight of mourning settled heavily across the house. Mrs. Allan sat at the dining table, her gaze quiet yet filled with unspoken thoughts. Steam still rose from the dishes, but no one lifted their chopsticks. The air carried the stale scent of tension, as if every breath bore the weight of something unsaid. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted a bowl of rice, only to stop midway, as though something unseen held her back. In her eyes flickered a deep conflict between worry for Uri and the heavy burden of a secret she had locked away. The soft clink of a spoon against porcelain rang hollow, echoing through the suffocating silence. No words passed, yet her glance kept drifting toward Uri's room, as if waiting for an inevitable disruption. Unease seeped into every corner, transforming a simple meal into a muted performance. On her face, the mask of composure began to crack, revealing shadows of regret and the fear of exposure. Each slow breath she drew seemed to reverberate through the stillness, carrying with it a fragile sense of collapse. In that moment, the house no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a sealed box, where hidden truths lingered in the shadows, waiting for the inevitable moment to erupt. The afternoon descended, scattering dim streaks of light across the tiled floor. Allan stepped into the yard, his figure heavy, as if each step carried the weight of an unspoken burden. In the stillness, he stopped, eyes fixed on the distant void, searching for an answer he could not name. Fragments of blurred memories surged back, pressing into his mind, etching brief flashes of torment across his face. Inside the house, Mrs. Allan watched from afar, her gaze tense, the watchful eyes of someone guarding a secret she refused to let surface. Between them stretched an invisible thread, binding two souls in an ambiguous tie, part debtor, part keeper of each other's hidden truths. The evening wind stirred, carrying the brittle rustle of leaves like a vague warning of an oncoming storm. Allan lowered his head slightly, his hand tightening, as if some decision was quietly crystallizing within him. In the twilight, his inner struggle unfolded like a silent canvas, every glance and gesture painted in the shades of tragedy. The house stood unmoving, a mute witness to the concealed conflict, holding its breath as though waiting for the silence to shatter, for hidden truths to break free in a storm of revelation. Nightfall descended, darkness seeping into every corner of the house, thickening the air with a suffocating heaviness. Uri sat beside the bed, his tired eyes fixed on the faint glow of a dim lamp. On his youthful face, worry and exhaustion etched deep lines, as though the long days of suffering had drained him completely. In the adjacent room, Mrs. Allan stood with arms crossed, leaning against the wall, her gaze lowered to the cold floor. She seemed to be calculating, torn between two choices, protecting her secret or surrendering part of it in search of an escape. At that moment, Uri's dry cough pierced the silence, shattering the stillness and dragging everyone back into the weight of reality. Outside on the porch, Allan tilted his head slightly, his eyes reflecting confusion and guilt. He, more than anyone, seemed to understand the cost of silence, yet his legs felt shackled, unable to cross the threshold. Inside the small house, each person was imprisoned in a private fear, longing to break free yet terrified of confrontation. No words were spoken, but the silence weighed heavier than accusations could ever be. The night became a curtain, concealing hidden calculations and inner torment, yet at the same time preparing to unveil an irreversible turning point. At dawn, pale sunlight filtered through the cracks of the door, falling across Uri's pallid face. His breathing remained uneven, chest heaving as though battling an invisible storm. Tu Tieu sat close, her trembling hands steadying themselves against his, as if trying to pass him her fragile sense of calm. Fatigue weighed heavily in her eyes, yet somewhere deep within, a faint spark of hope refused to die. Across the room, Mrs. Allan quietly set a bowl of medicine on the table. Her hand trembled slightly, her gaze averted, as though fearing that someone might pierce through the secrets she carried within. The tension in the air was so sharp that even the smallest motion seemed to echo like thunder. Allan stepped inside, morning light catching his face and revealing the war within him. His eyes locked onto the bowl of medicine, the very object where suspicion, regret, and fear converged. No one spoke, but every glance exchanged cut through the silence like invisible blades. Outside, birdsong rang brightly, mocking the suffocating atmosphere inside the small room. In that moment, they all understood that a decision hovered near, and a truth could no longer remain concealed. The fragile stillness seemed ready to shatter, preparing to sweep everyone into an oncoming storm. As evening fell, the room sank into a dim, golden haze, as though dust had settled over the air itself. Uri lay motionless, his breathing faint, his face pale as if clinging to the last fragile thread of life. Tu Tieu sat nearby, her eyes heavy with sleepless nights, her heart burdened by questions that found no answers. Her gaze lingered on the untouched bowl of medicine resting on the table, now a symbol of mistrust and unease. Mrs. Allan stood near the window, her shoulders slumped, her face etched with fatigue and secrets too long hidden. In the fiery glow of dusk, the lines on her face deepened, carved like scars of past mistakes. Allan sat quietly in the corner, hands clenched tightly together, his eyes fixed on the ground. He knew silence could no longer protect him, yet the truth lodged in his throat like a heavy stone, suffocating every breath. Outside, The wind stirred through the trees, scattering fragments of dying sunlight across the silent room. In that moment, silence no longer offered refuge. It hovered instead like a sentence waiting to be delivered. Something was about to break open. A confession, perhaps, or a wound too deep to ever heal. None of them dared to meet each other's eyes, for within those glances lay the answers they all feared most. Night fell, and the pale moonlight poured into the room, heavy with unspoken tension. Uri stirred faintly, his shallow breath echoing like the fragile knock of life at death's door. Tu Tieu moved quietly to his side, her trembling hands resting on his cold fingers, her eyes brimming with tears yet burning with resolve. Behind her stood Mrs. Allan, torn between stepping forward and retreating, as though the few steps between them had stretched into an unbridgeable chasm. Her dim eyes carried secrets too long concealed, and in that silence, her hesitation carved the emptiness between them even deeper. Then, Allan rose abruptly, his breath uneven, sweat glistening across his face, his gaze fierce with a final decision. He stepped out of the shadows and into the dim glow, and the room seemed to freeze. There was no more refuge in silence, no more hiding in shadows. The truth he bore was a fire that could burn everything to ashes, yet perhaps also the only light that could save the souls trapped within. Moonlight fractured across the walls, and the moment hardened into a hinge of fate, where past and present collided with brutal force, swinging open the door to an uncertain future. Each heartbeat thundered louder, for they all knew this was the moment that would change everything. The sky at dusk pressed heavily, painting the scene in a bleak, foreboding shade. It seemed the truth had finally come to light, yet deep inside, a void remained untouched. Tu Tieu stood still, her eyes drifting into the distance, as if listening to the sound of her own heartbeat echoing in the heavy silence of the night. Uri clenched his fist, not only with determination, but with the fear of what unseen shadows still waited ahead. Somewhere unseen, a figure lingered, watching quietly like a wolf in the dark forest, never letting its prey escape. Justice may have begun, but the game of power, money, and deception was far from over. The half-closed door behind them whispered of another chapter, one where the truth would cut even deeper, and wounds that had barely begun to heal would be torn open once again. This is only the beginning.